Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Nice to see you. And I don't know how many people are on Zoom. 29 so far. Yesterday we had more than 300 people register, and it was very busy on Zoom yesterday. But today is in person, and this is amazing. I'm happy you made it here. And I want to welcome you, but I also want to thank our sponsor, and because this wouldn't have been possible without Heterodox Academy helping us set up this Heterodox Conversation. And we have our two speakers here. I will say a few more words about them later. But what is a heterodox conversation? And the idea is really to not go into a debate where we cut each other's throat. It is about academic inquiry, about the process of examining, investigating, interpreting the evidence. How do you come to conclusions? And I'm looking forward that our speakers will take us along the way and show us their path. But for that, we would need only one person. But we have two, because the other part is the engagement. Is like, if people disagree, not just if people disagree, but especially if people disagree, can we have a conversation? Can we examine things with each other? Can we ask more questions? Are we curious to understand? And maybe, hopefully, all of us will go home today and have seen some inquiry and exploration, but also understanding of something that we weren't aware before, or that wasn't really the way we thought. So let me see what else I wanted to say. So Heterodox Academy came up with some rules, or the heterodox way. And we have a poster over there showing the way, but I have here a slide, and there it is. And this is kind of a recommendation for our speakers, but for all of us. So when we talk, can we make our case with evidence? And you don't always have the research and the meta-analysis and the study in your pocket, but can we go beyond opinion? And if we have evidence for something, bring it. Otherwise, be at least respectful, hear the other person out, be intellectually charitable. Maybe the other one does have a point. Maybe there is something that makes sense. And maybe I'm not always right, or not 100%, or maybe I could improve, or there is something for me to learn. So can we be a bit humble and constructive? Really try to listen and to understand the other one. And not just to then prove them wrong, but to get it. And maybe we still want to prove them wrong. But first it's about understanding, genuine curiosity. And the last thing, be yourself. Well, show yourself. Many of us are afraid nowadays to say something or to ask a question. We are not even against it. We just want to think things through. But we're afraid that we are then attacked as a person or misinterpreted as a person. So it takes a bit of courage. But you're here. People on Zoom were there yesterday. There was a very active chat box. And a lot of diverse opinions. Not that everyone thought the same, so I was very happy about the speakers presenting diverse opinions, but also that I saw we didn't just attract people who think this way. We thought we had many different opinions there. And there's a bit more information about how it's supposed to go today. So each of our speakers will present for 15 to 20 minutes their view of the matter. Then there's a second part where the two of them will talk with each other and ask each other questions and trying to bring it a bit further. And then the third part is that we all can engage in the conversation. And we have people on Zoom, so we'll try to take one question from Zoom, one question in the room. We have microphones here. Yeah, it's important that we only use the microphones, because otherwise the Zoom people will not hear what you say or what the question was. Yeah. And yeah, afterwards, you see cards on the table. They have a QR code. Let us know what you thought about the day. And we even have an interviewer in the room, and he can talk with you in English and in French. Anything that you might have to say. So now, yeah, Sophia and Azim. So both university professors, Sophia, professor of law and philosophy in Toronto, Azim in BC, professor of psychology. And it was on our conference advertisement, but again, a few words. So Sophia is co-organizer of the Tort Law and Social Equality Project that runs across several Canadian law schools. The project focuses on many ways in which our laws are still disadvantaging social groups that already are struggling, and even unintendedly difficulties. Her current academic work focuses on discrimination. Right. Okay. On systemic discrimination, so structural injustices and questions in moral and political philosophy. She has advised organizations such as Human Rights Watch. Her work has been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada. And then she is the editor and books and like a lot of things that you can read about her, and makes me want to ask more questions. Azim, also very impressive resume. He directs the Center of Applied Moral Psychology. His research is focusing on psychology of morality, and then how it relates to religion, politics, technology, and beyond the science. Of course, he has done a lot of scientific publications and presentations, but beyond that, he has also written for the New York Times. He has spoken at the Aspen Ideas Festival, at the TED Conference, and he's teaching a free, massive online open course on the science of religion for the public. I had a quick look yesterday, was tempted to start it, but yeah, he's a fellow of the Association of Psychological Science, and most recently, he was a faculty fellow at the Center for Academic Pluralism in New York. And I think at that point, I would hand it over to Azim.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you guys all for having me and for coming. Our topic is, what is the proper place for EDI initiatives in Canada? And there's so many different things we could talk about. We could talk about diversity training. We could talk about academic freedom. We could talk about diversity statements. The thing I want to talk about, the thing I was working on at that Center for Academic Pluralism, is on the rationales for pursuing diversity in faculty hiring. And this is an issue that we all have a stake in. Many of us are faculty who were hired at some point. Some of us aspire to be that. And all of us have at least been taught by these faculty. So we all have a general stake in this. I want to tell you a little bit about why I'm personally interested in this. And to do that, I need you guys to indulge me with a little history of my life. I'm embarrassed to say that this is only my second time on the McGill campus. The first time was 25 years ago, when I was choosing where I was going to go for undergrad. And it was a particularly snowy day here. And maybe solely on that fact, I decided to go to a much inferior institution in Toronto. After that, I went to UBC for my graduate work. And then I went to the US for a while, and I was rehired at UBC in 2018. And that's relevant because EDI and my own race was an acute factor in that hiring. So I was hired under this Canada 150 Research Chair program, which Canada threw for its 150th birthday in 2017, where they sponsored a small number of chairs for around the country, and all the departments and all the universities in the country competed for getting some of those, for nominating people, for getting some people to hold those chairs. And importantly, in the call it said that preference will be given to members of 4 equity-deserving groups: women, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and racialized minorities. Preference. And the UBC psychology department decided that for the people that they were going to nominate, to play it safe, to increase their odds of winning that competition, they would only nominate people from those 4 groups. Because why take the risk? It turned out to be a good gamble for that department. It turned out to be a good gamble for me. I got one of those chairs. I get to go back to my hometown in Vancouver. I got to go back to UBC. It was great. It's great. I'm not giving that job back. But it made me know that I was there not solely because of my research and teaching expertise and promise, but I was there because of partly, I don't know how big a part, but partly because of an accident of birth. And it made me know that all my colleagues knew that as well. And for my department, they were dealing with a much smaller pool of potential people that they were picking the talent from. And so those are costs. For whatever benefits they may bring, those are costs. And we should weigh those costs against the reasons why we have those particular preferences. That's fine. The problem is that those reasons were never made clear to me. And as I've sat on more and more search committees, I've realized that, well, people don't actually talk very much about the rationales we have for pursuing diversity when we do hire faculty. And I'm not sure why we don't. I have some suspicions. Annett mentioned that I study the psychology of religion. In the psychology of religion, one of the things we talk about a lot are sacred values. Now, sacred values are a particular phenomenon that have 4 particular characteristics. So one is they tend to be about emotionally charged issues of moral or ethical importance. 2, their protection tends to be tied to personal or group identities. 3, importantly, they tend to be non-negotiable. So they're resistant to compromises or trade-offs. People don't like trading things off for them. And 4, even questioning them tends to be met with moral outrage. And for some people, I think diversity has become a sacred value. Not for everybody. For others, the value of diversity may just be obvious and common sense. But we as academics are in the business of interrogating what seems like common sense, of questioning what is unquestioned, and we are not in the business of worshiping sacred cows. And to not do so for this particular question would be failing to live up to the standard that we hold for every other topic that we study. So I think we should do it. And so I've been on a little mini mission to try to talk about what those rationales for diversity are, to try to make these implicit rationales that people have more explicit. And here's the list that I came up with. I'm gonna, this is the main slide of my talk, so I'll leave it up there for a little bit. But there's a few of these that I want to talk about particularly. I don't have time to talk about all of them. But let's start with the first one, which is avoiding hiring biases. Now, I've put this in this family category of hidden merit because that's what hiring biases do. They prevent us, they interfere with our ability to figure out who the actually most meritorious or best candidate is. The slides will be a bit messed up, I assure you. One of the reasons why we might be concerned about a homogeneous faculty is that it might be homogeneous because of biased reasons. It might be homogeneous because people have a tendency towards homophily. We like people who are like us. And so any body will tend to perpetuate itself by giving preference to people that are like them, even at the expense of the people who actually would be, in this case, the best scholar. So that happens. Importantly, we have to not mistake homogeny for bias perfectly. They are different things. There may be other reasons why why a department doesn't end up perfectly representative of the population. For one, there could be differences in the ability to get into the applicant pool. There could be cultural differences. So I'm a South Asian social psychologist. And I will tell you that it is no Asian parent's dream that their kid grows up to become a social psychologist. So if there is a disparity of South Asians in psychology, it might not be because psychology is biased against Asians in favor of white people. It could be that Asians are biased against psychology in favor of becoming a cardiologist or something. So that's an innocuous example, but it does mean that we can't mistake homogeneity for discrimination necessarily, and we can't mistake diversity for fairness necessarily. Now, the other aspect of merit that I want to talk about. Oh, by the way, the data, always support with evidence. Annett asked for the meta-analyses. Where do our biases actually lurk? We can't use disparity as a measure of bias, but psychologists, social psychologists in particular, have been studying this a lot. We've been studying this for a long time, and we've gotten pretty good at actually being able to figure out where hiring biases are. One of the most common experiments that we use now is something called the correspondence experiment. And the correspondence experiment means that you send fake applications for real positions that are largely equivalent in terms of qualifications, but vary on the particular category that you're interested in measuring. So you could name somebody in one application Emily and Aisha in another application, or you could vary the gender, or you could vary whatever you want. The meta-analysis recently came out that analyzed virtually every correspondence study that's ever been done, about 170 studies, and it reveals where our biases lurk. Many are in familiar locations, places you'd expect. So just to orient you, everything on this side is those groups received fewer callbacks. Everything on this side means those groups received more callbacks than you would expect for their qualification. And you see here are the racial and religious discrimination. So we do see Black, Asian, Hispanic, Muslim participants do get fewer callbacks than they should, though there is variability depending on where you do those studies for which groups get fewer callbacks. You also see some things maybe that you wouldn't expect, or maybe that you would expect but we don't talk about very much. So there's an old age bias, physically unattractive bias. And there's a very small preference for women, though there's an enormous amount of variability in the studies that are done there. But that's in the general population for all jobs. What about in academia? So we don't have 170 studies that have been done on academia, but we do have some. And here's a recent one. This doesn't use a correspondence study. This uses something called a conjoint experiment, but it's reasonably similar. And here's what we see there. So instead of seeing the racial bias in academia against non-white minorities, we see a preference for non-white minorities. We see, again, the preference for women, and we see these are the meritorious categories of research and teaching. We see larger preferences for those things, which is what we'd hope to see. Now, it may surprise some of you that the people in academia who are most biased against are white men, but it probably only seems surprising to you if you haven't sat in a search committee for a while. The other area that we have pronounced biases is on politics. And this is, I think, something that probably most people are familiar with, the disparity between liberals and conservatives in academia, but as we talked about, disparities alone don't indicate discrimination. What does indicate discrimination is when people say that they would discriminate. And this is a study done by a colleague of Sophia's at U of T, Yoel Imbar. You find that about 38% of my colleagues in social psychology say that they would discriminate against a political outgroup. And they think that their colleagues would do even worse. So they're openly admitting to discriminating there. So if we want to see where our hiring biases are, it is white conservative men. If all you cared about was this rationale, hiring biases, then that's where you should be concerned about seeing discrimination. That's where you should be concerned about trying to improve diversity. But of course, it's not all we care about. There's many other rationales. The other one that I wanted to mention is accounting for prior discrimination. So simply the person who has the best application at the time of the application doesn't mean that they're going to be the best person to do the job. There could be differences in the opportunities people had to get to that particular point. Somebody who had fewer opportunities and produced, say, the same number of strong papers is likely to be a better and more promising scholar going forward. What we're trying to do by looking at past experiences, predict future experience. And usually that's a pretty good prediction. But if there's something that systematically undercounts somebody's past experience, then, well, that's going to lead to discrimination. So if all you care about is getting the most meritorious candidate, you have to factor in these reduced opportunities before the point of application. But I'm not the discrimination expert here. Sophia is. So maybe we'll hear more about this, or we can talk about it more in the Q&A. The other one that I wanted to get to, okay, there's your formula. All right, the other one I wanted to get to is this one, improving educational student outcomes. So having people at the front of the class who look like the students could improve their ability to learn as measured by grades, graduation rates, and whatever metrics we have. And this was one, I will admit, was one of the more persuasive arguments to me before I actually looked at the evidence. Once I looked at the evidence, I found that there wasn't an overwhelming amount of support for this. There are many studies done on this. Some show positive effects, but there's a paper by Koch and Zahidi which says for every positive effect you see in this area for educational role modeling, there's another that shows a null effect. And once you factor in publication bias, which tends to undercount the negative effects, the actual effect on teacher match or the effect of diversity on measures like grades and graduation rate is likely to be very small. That's not to say that it's insignificant, but the effect size needs to be factored in when we think about what we're balancing it against, once we're balancing it against those costs that I talked about earlier. All right, so we're now in full-on backlash to EDI territory. There's a backlash to the backlash. And I think that this is very unfortunate because I don't think that there are many better answers on the other side of the pendulum. I think that the sort of censorious laws that are being passed in Texas and Florida are just more of the same top-down imposition of political agendas, just ones on the other side. I don't think there are many answers to be found there. There are always going to be people who are xenophobic and who are going to resist EDI initiatives regardless of what they are, regardless of how well-reasoned or well-supported by evidence they are. All indications suggest that there's not very many of those types of people within academia. Most people who are resistant to EDI, like most people who are supportive of EDI in academia, tend to be fair-minded and reasonable people. On the resistance side, I think most people have a couple of problems. One is that there tend to be more and more diversity initiatives which are either unsupported by evidence or overclaim the evidence or are directly contradicted by the evidence. And so we don't know why we're doing it. The other fear and frustration is that some people might be using DEI policies, or EDI as we call them in Canada, EDI policies to exclude people who think differently and create a bit of an intellectual monoculture. So I'll tell you another story. I was on a search committee. I won't tell you which university this was at, but we were talking about preferences for minority candidates. And one of my colleagues said, well, we don't want a Clarence Thomas. Now, I don't particularly like Clarence Thomas's politics or his judicial philosophy or his ethics. And I imagine Sophia probably doesn't either, I don't know. But Clarence Thomas would have added tremendous diversity to our department on almost any dimension, not least because he's not a psychologist at all. That would have been great. And he also would have added benefits along all of those diversity rationales, almost all of those diversity rationales that I showed. So why didn't people want him? Well, it goes back to that homophily point. People want to stack the deck for people on their own side. And that's a natural tendency. It's an understandable one. It's just one that happens to be antithetical to the mission of the university. I think that people who are reaching for an intellectual homogeneity are doing it to make their lives better when we need to be making our lives worse. we need to not only tolerate people with different views, we need to not only tolerate people we don't like, we have to go out and hire them. We need to make our lives harder for ourselves by having people who are going to frustrate us and challenge us. Because ultimately, these jobs are not really about us at all. They're about what we can offer society. And I think we offer society the most when we create an open academy that, in the words of Jonathan Rauch, protects dissent rather than protects us from dissent. So I have a 1.5-year-old son, and 16 years from now, he's going to be standing right here on some snowy day, and he's going to be wondering whether he should come to McGill. And that gives us 16 years, I think, to improve the EDI system in our universities, and I think we can do it. And here's how I would do it. So 4 principles. The first one is be honest about the aims that you have. So if your rationale for pursuing diversity in faculty hiring is something like social restitution, let's say that, and let's talk about it. 2 and 3. 2, be rigorous in evaluating how they achieve those aims. So academics occupy an important space in society, and it's because we have expertise, but that expertise only has credibility because it rests on rigorous methods and evidence. And if we relax or throw out those standards in the pursuit of activism or in the pursuit of a sacred cause, then we also throw out our expertise and our credibility with them. We shouldn't do that. We have a credibility problem as it is. So 3, be open about the trade-offs. Diversity and inclusion are very important values, and maybe equity too, depending on how we define it. We can talk about that. But so are things like fairness and autonomy and freedom and truth and openness. Those are all also good values. And these aren't always at loggerheads. Often these things will be aligned, but they won't always be aligned. And part of being a grown-up is recognizing that you have to make trade-offs and compromises between different values that you're interested in. And all those trade-offs and compromises involve loss. We can't always get what we want. And then finally, we ought to, instead of trying to insulate ourselves in orthodoxy and protect ourselves from dissent, we should try to do the same thing that we do for all our other topics to this topic. We should expose it to the strongest criticism possible and then use our arguments and evidence to persuade. All right, thank you.
Come. I just realized I forgot to mention something. We have a photographer in the room. And originally I was going to say, if you don't want to be on any picture, take a sticker and put it on your shirt. Now I forgot that. Maybe you could also, at the end, tell us you want to be removed, because he will bring these photos and maybe short videos also to Heterodox Academy, and it might be on their website. So yeah, make sure if you that you're not there if you don't want to be there. And what else? Oh yeah, is the microphone loud enough? Did you hear our speaker? Yeah, okay. And as I said...
Is it loud enough for the Zoom people? Oh yeah. Yeah, let's say it's not.
Okay, good. Yeah, yeah. So we have a few speakers. I thought to put them on your door, but if you want to have them now, to make sure you are not filmed.
Okay, thanks Azim, thanks Annette, thanks very much to all of you for coming out. I really look forward to our discussions. So whereas Azim is a psychologist pursuing empirical work on EDI, I'm a legal scholar and philosopher, as Annette mentioned, and I work on discrimination law and theory, which one of the things I hope you'll take away from our remarks is that's actually not what you might think it is. Some people use the term discrimination and they think of bias and prejudice. Actually, most of Canadian anti-discrimination law and a whole lot of international anti-discrimination law is really about trying to interrogate which policies exacerbate pre-existing disadvantages in ways that are unfair. So it's actually not about castigating people for having illicit motives or rejecting certain people as prejudiced. That's not what I do at all. And it's not from that standpoint that I'm interested in thinking about EDI. I'm part of a group of scholars all over the world, not just in Canada and the US, but in places like India, Brazil, Mexico, Israel, Germany, South Africa, and we're trying to think about patterns of disadvantage in society. So often we use the term systemic discrimination for that. And the point of our investigations is to think about how various policies, even neutral policies that there are many good reasons for having, end up inadvertently exacerbating disadvantage, what we can do about, and what the trade-offs are in these sorts of situations. So my aim today isn't to suggest that all EDI initiatives in universities are praiseworthy or unproblematic. That's not what I think at all. Rather, in the course of discussing how we can see various EDI initiatives as responses to systemic discrimination, I'm going to refer to a very wide range of these initiatives. And I hope you'll see that you can endorse some of these and reject others. So there's no need to say that you either agree with EDI as a concept or disagree with it as a concept. I think there's room for all of us to talk about the merits and demerits of various particular EDI initiatives. Okay, I'm going to start with a story. I was once the only woman at a conference dinner in legal philosophy. This happens a lot because it's a rather male-dominated discipline. There's no problem with that. At the end of dinner, we all got up, and someone at the other end of the table shouted out to the conference organizer, "Great dinner, but Rick monopolized Sophia all night. Next time, bring along a woman for each of the rest of us, wouldn't you?" Now, what's remarkable about this is that actually the person who said that was himself a scholar of discrimination law and had done pioneering work on sexual harassment and sexual discrimination. And no, he didn't mean it as a joke. He's somebody with great respect for women, and he went on to become one of my most cherished mentors. But as the story suggests, the stereotype that women in a social setting are largely charming dinner table companions and not really us was clearly so strong that after a few drinks in a social setting, that's sort of how he saw me. So what do I take away from this story? Anybody can inadvertently stereotype others, even experts in discrimination law. It's easier to fall into stereotyping when there are fewer members of the stereotype group present. There's actually a fair bit of social science research on this, some of it done by Susan Fisk at Princeton. Discrimination sets up invisible barriers that can't be dismantled by one person alone. Clearly, it would have been ill-advisable for me in that situation to engage in what I might have thought was consciousness raising. That was a social setting. It would have ruined the evening. I said nothing. Often, it can't be by individual acts. It needs to be by changing certain sorts of social policies and structures, and within an institution like the university, certain kinds of policies and practices that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so my objectives in this talk are fourfold. I want firstly to explore what systemic discrimination is, and I want to suggest that we can see many EDI initiatives in universities as remedies for it. I want, secondly, to point out that some EDI initiatives are actually much less controversial than you might think. Some of them enrich everyone's learning while disadvantaging no one. Some of them give underrepresented groups access to the same kinds of privileges that others already have. I want, thirdly, to offer an idea from discrimination theory that I think might be helpful to us in thinking through EDI, and it's the idea of transformative equality. And it functions as a kind of alternative to EDI in many cases that allows us to avoid disadvantaging already disadvantaged groups while being much more inclusive and not confining special treatment and advantages to those groups. So I'm going to talk about what transformative equality might look like in certain cases. And then I want to discuss what's at stake when there is no transformative option, and it seems like we might need to single out an underrepresented group for special treatment. Because like Azim, I think it's important to be open about the kinds of trade-offs that those sorts of situations involve. what is discrimination? As I and other discrimination theorists understand it, discrimination is an act or practice that has the effect of disadvantaging someone because of an actual or presumed trait. Much of my work has argued that discrimination wrongs people when it contributes to their being second-class citizens in their institution or society, rather than the equals of everyone else. And I argue in a lengthy book, most of which I will not repeat before you now, but you can take a look at it if you're interested, that we have a right, as against our governments and institutions and even fellow human beings, to a certain kind of social standing equal to that of others. And I also argue that Canadian universities have an obligation as institutions that control access to an important public good, that is higher education, to distribute that good in ways that don't perpetuate an underclass. So I'm thinking of discrimination here as disadvantage that accrues to an already disadvantaged group in the kind of way that ends up leaving them as second-class citizens. And it's important to note that not all disadvantage does this. So my claim isn't that all disadvantage is bad. Lots of disadvantage is an inevitable byproduct of just living together. And so one important question I think we need to ask when we think about certain kinds of disadvantages and ED policies that attempt to rectify them is this the kind of disadvantage that risks creating an underclass or not? Okay, I mentioned that I approach discrimination from the standpoint of systemic discrimination. What is that? Importantly, it's not just the aggregate of many individual acts of discrimination. It's not just lots of discrimination. Rather, it involves institutional practices that often appear neutral but further disadvantage already disadvantaged social groups. So what's an example of this? Well, I work in a law school. As you know, law school admissions processes often use algorithms to weigh GPAs from different universities. This is very common. The way the algorithms work is they standardly assign a higher score to GPAs from universities that tend to send more students to law school and whose students do better at law school. Then they assign to the GPAs from those students who hail from places that hardly ever send someone to law school. For instance, community colleges, or whose students have performed poorly at law school in part because they haven't been well prepared. So you can see how, even though this kind of rule doesn't explicitly single out minority students on the basis of something like their racial background, it's going to disproportionately disadvantage racial minorities in a society where such students have fewer opportunities to attend wealthy and prestigious universities that send a lot of kids to law school. So that's just one example. When lawyers and lawmakers think of discrimination systemically, we try and think about the interaction of various institutional practices and policies. So hold in your mind that practice I just mentioned of weighting GPAs in a certain way, and imagine it working, as it often does, alongside another practice that law school admissions committees often use, of sorting files into four groups. There's A, B, C, D, based on people's LSAT scores, where A is the group with the highest LSAT scores and D is the group with the lowest scores. But there are relatively tiny differences between the borders, like as in there are tiny differences between the lowest LSAT score in the C bundle and the highest LSAT score in the D bundle. But yet admissions officers are directed to choose far more files from Group C than from Group D. So if the D group has more minority candidates in it, they're then going to have much less of a chance of being accepted based on what is, in some cases, a very small difference. Now, when you combine these two policies, even though both of them look neutral, and of course they're not intended to disadvantage minority groups, they do end up disproportionately disadvantaging already disadvantaged groups. So this is one example of the way in which apparently neutral policies kind of work together to reinforce disadvantage. Now, sometimes the solution is just to change the policies. Berkeley, which had this policy of grouping its files into A, B, C, D, realized that there was this effect and then changed the policy. But other times, any combination of apparently neutral rules is going to have disadvantageous effects when it's applied in a society where there are already significant pre-existing disadvantages for certain social groups. So it might then be necessary in our procedure to adopt an additional rule that explicitly gives certain groups an advantage to compensate for the disadvantages that our own practices have introduced. Okay, as I hope was implicit in what I just said about systemic discrimination, it operates on 3 levels. Colleen Shepard, actually it's a law professor here at McGill, who's done wonderful work on this, and especially in her book, Inclusive Equality, calls these 3 levels the interpersonal level, the institutional level, and the systemic level. At the interpersonal level, that's probably what you most often think about when you think about discrimination, injustices as between one person and another. But of course, we need to think about the institutional level, those sorts of practices and policies that I just discussed for which there are certain strong reasons, but they seem to do a better job at representing or accommodating some groups' needs rather than others. And then there's the systemic level where we think about the way in which different practices and policies from different institutions create mutually reinforcing patterns of disadvantage. Okay, I'm going to focus for the moment on 2 important aspects of systemic discrimination at the institutional level, because I think these are what many EDI policies are explicitly designed to address. The first is the way in which systemic discrimination is often sustained by something that in my work I have called structural accommodations. These are very neutral rules and practices that are well designed and that meet the needs of the majority of people, but in the process inadvertently don't meet the needs of others. So one example of this is faculty meetings from 4 to 6 p.m. One of the departments that I used to be a member of used to hold faculty meetings from 4 to 6 p.m. This is pretty innocuous. It made a lot of sense when most of the faculty were male and didn't have childcare duties. Why? Well, 4 to 6 p.m., it's the end of the day, classes are mostly over, you're tired, you can't do your research. That's a good time then to get together for faculty meetings. Unfortunately, once more women became academics in the department, and these women had partners in jobs who couldn't leave work early to pick up the kids from daycare, the women faculty ended up all leaving faculty meetings at around 5:45 p.m. So there was this rather unfortunate exodus of women from the faculty meeting all at this particular time. So this was then an example of a neutral structural accommodation that unfortunately then fed into various gender stereotypes, right? All the women get up in the middle of the meeting, and then this starts to confirm people's worry that women can't focus properly on their job when they have kids and that they really ought to stay home. It was only actually when there was a male colleague who happened to have primary responsibility for picking up his kids from daycare that the chair decided the meeting time could change to 3 to 5 p.m. That's actually an example of what I'm going to talk about in a minute as transformative equality. Instead of making an exception for women that singled them out, what the department did was actually just to find a different time that everybody could meet. It's transformative because it transformed the existing rule, and one of the huge advantages of it, of course, was that it didn't single anybody out, and it ended up being advantageous for everyone. Ironically, not just the group that it was intended to advantage. Now male colleagues, too, could pick up their kids from daycare without having to worry that they'd make a scene by exiting the meeting early. Another example of an innocuous structural accommodation is networking over drinks after work. This is a lovely practice. Of course, in most departments, everybody is welcome. But if there's a woman faculty member from a culture where women don't go to a bar with a bunch of guys, or someone of any gender who has extensive caregiving obligations, not just, say, their own kids, but elderly relatives or other family members who rely on them, they're then disadvantaged because they can't engage in that kind of networking. What's the alternative? Well, as another kind of example of transformative equality, lunchtime networking. A number of law schools that I've been at and visited at have made tremendous efforts to encourage informal networking by all colleagues over lunchtime. And again, this is done in a totally inclusive way. It helps to have resources. And I gather one of the things we'll be talking about later is that a lot of these transformations of policies are much easier to effect if there are copious resources in an institution. But institutions can do things to facilitate transformations of what used to be more unintentionally exclusive practices. Now, one thing I want to mention here, and I'm happy to talk more about later, is that the point of my calling these things structural accommodations is to note that even though they look neutral, they actually already accommodate certain people's needs rather than others. I don't take that to be inherently objectionable. Obviously, it makes sense to adopt policies that at the time serve the needs of most of the people in the room. But what it means is when we start to see certain things as structural accommodations, we can see that certain people's needs are already accommodated. And then we need to ask, all right, who are the people whose needs aren't accommodated? And how can we try and recraft our policies so as to take them into consideration too? So when you look at certain existing policies as structural accommodations, you're more likely then to see the requests of excluded groups not as requests for special treatment and extra benefits, but as requests for access to the same kinds of privileges that others already have. So I think it's important to ask, when you see certain kinds of EDI initiatives, for instance, special mentorship programs for PhD students from underrepresented backgrounds, is this a response to a structural accommodation in situations where more privileged groups already have the good in question, and we're just trying to make sure that underrepresented groups have access to it too? Now, that obviously doesn't end the discussion. There's lots of room to ask, is this the best way to deal with this problem, or should we try and use transformative equality? Is there a possibility of, for instance, expanding our mentorship programs so that everyone who needs a mentor or wants a mentor can have one? Those are questions that we need to ask. Okay, also at the institutional level, another feature of systemic discrimination that I think is relevant to EDI that I want to call your attention to involves the persistence of certain stereotypes. My colleague Rebecca Cook has done a lot of work, not just in her book, but with a lot of different international human rights organizations, on thinking through stereotypes and on the importance of naming and identifying them. The term stereotype was actually coined by a French printer in 1798, and it was used to describe a method of printing where a cast metal plate was used to make a number of identical copies of something. So a stereotype, in a sense, is a generalization that treats members of a group as though they were identical copies. As we think of it in law, it's a generalized view or preconception of the characteristics possessed by or the proper roles for a certain social group. Now, a lot of recent work in philosophy and law has gone into showing how certain stereotypes become embedded in institutional policies and are used to rationalize certain policies and practices even when we don't voice them, and end up then misconstruing and disadvantaging certain groups. So one stereotype that I put on the PowerPoint that's at work tacitly in many university departments, where women faculty are channeled into nurturing roles like the dean of students or the associate chair in charge of teaching, but not encouraged to occupy leadership roles at the top, is the stereotype that women are somehow inherently more nurturing than men and less good at aggressive negotiation and leadership. I hope you'll note from this that the sense in which stereotypes are problematic to me is the sense in which they sometimes get baked into certain practices and unquestioned. And Azim and I can talk about this later, but I think this is one of those places where we're in agreement that it's one of the benefits of looking at particular EDI policies and at the rationale for them is that it will help us question what might otherwise be unquestioned stereotypes. Often, stereotypes portray a certain group in a monolithic way, failing to see differences within the group and failing to consider what we call intersectionality, so ways in which multiple traits of a person can intersect and shape their experience and lead to subgroups that are quite different within a larger group. This is actually very important for us to bear in mind when designing particular EDI initiatives. So for instance, when we think of how to design a mentorship program for Black students, we need to be very careful not to have in our mind some image of the stereotypical Black student, for instance, some image of Black students only as young, and to ignore the needs of mature Black students, or to ignore the needs of mixed race students. And it's sometimes the case that in order to eliminate stereotypes and to really see intersectionality, we need a critical mass of certain groups among faculty or among students. So this is often one of the points of temporary quotas. Okay. So I've now done a couple of the objectives that I said I was going to try and reach. I've explored a little bit of what systemic discrimination is, and I've suggested that we can see some EDI initiatives as remedies for it. I've suggested that in some cases we should really, rather than singling out a particular minority group, aim instead for what I call transformative equality. And I've tried to show that some EDI initiatives give underrepresented groups just access to the same privileges that structural accommodations already give to more privileged groups. So I think it's a mistake to say of all EDI initiatives that they single out underrepresented groups for for special benefits. They don't always. Often they just single them out to give them what others already have. But I want to turn now to my remaining aims. I want to talk about a range of EDI initiatives in universities, and I hope you'll see that some are less controversial, whereas others are more. And I want to talk briefly about the more controversial initiatives and suggest some of what is and isn't at stake when a university chooses them. 22 minutes now. I'll be 2 more minutes. First, in terms of the wide range, I've grouped this, as you've probably seen as you've been looking over this, starting with what things that I think of as less controversial and moving toward more controversial. Less controversial includes simply giving marginalized groups equal access to privileges that others already have. So for instance, not segregating classes by gender. McGill, for the first 50 years of its existence, segregated classes by gender. We wouldn't dream of doing that now, but at the time when it was first suggested that men and women should sit in classes together, this was thought of as a very troubling kind of initiative. Accessible entrances to buildings, period products in washrooms, special efforts simply to alert marginalized candidates to jobs and invite applications from them, mentorship programs for members of marginalized groups. All of these things seem just to be giving marginalized groups equal access to privileges that others already have without taking anything away from the other groups. Then there's a set of EDI initiatives that we haven't talked much about, but I think it's really important to think about because they're often overlooked, but I think of them as very important, particularly in the context of systemic discrimination. And this involves enriching our knowledge while disadvantaging no one. So encouraging instructors to share diverse viewpoints and perspectives, adding Indigenous knowledge to the curriculum. I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about this later because some of the initiatives we've undertaken at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law have really made a lasting impression on me. I wasn't entirely sold on them at the start, but I have realized just how much knowledge they have added to and how much they've added to all of our abilities to do our jobs in a better way than we could before. Lastly, though, there's the very controversial ones, assembling and supporting a critical mass of underrepresented scholars and students, which sometimes is done simply by involving some consideration of things like race or gender in hiring or admissions, and sometimes is done through quotas for particular groups. Okay, lastly, I want to talk about some very controversial things, which I'm hoping we can talk more together in the Q&A, and perhaps Azim and I can talk more about as well. What about those EDI initiatives that deny others an opportunity? They're really the most controversial. We need to ask, in these cases, do they do so justifiably? So I've put two positions. The truth is hopefully somewhere in the middle, but I put the skeptic's position, the person who thinks that it's unjustifiable to use EDI initiatives in cases where they deny others an opportunity, and I've put the advocate's position. So, and I'm trying to raise three different sorts of concerns here. So the skeptic might say, no, it's not justifiable. When we deny others an opportunity, so when there's an affirmative action program, a woman gets the job and a man is overlooked and doesn't get the job, we treat these other people, the men, unequally. The advocate would say, well, equality isn't about treating everyone the same. Equality is about ensuring that no social group forms an underclass of people who are thought inferior. What this part of the disagreement raises, I think, is something that we haven't yet talked about. Azim talked about trade-offs of values. Often there are different interpretations of the same value. And we need to have conversations about the kind of interpretation of a single value that we think is the best interpretation in a certain context. Then the skeptic sometimes says, look, EDI programs give benefits to those who are less qualified. And it's a problem because this is a departure from merit. Here, I think we need to have hard conversations about particular policies. In my experience, it's not often true that there's a departure from merit, particularly in academic hiring. Academia is so competitive these days that race and gender often just tip the balance in cases of equally meritorious candidates. We can talk more about that later. Lastly, this is a worry that I think underlies a lot of controversy about EDI measures. Some people say, look, the people who are denied certain jobs or the students who are denied places at universities also deserve them. Why should they pay the price for historic injustices that aren't their fault, right? And one of the things I've tried to suggest in my work on discrimination in my book is that it's helpful here to distinguish culpability for past injustices from responsibility for achieving justice now. You might say, it's true that it's not any of our faults that certain historic injustices happen, but we might, as members of our society, as people who want to live in a society in which there isn't an underclass, have some responsibility, nevertheless, for achieving justice now. And we can talk, we ought to have conversations, open conversations together about what that requires. Okay, thanks very much.
Well, thank you both very much. We are going to turn the camera now in the other direction so that Sophia and Azim can ask each other questions and explore their different viewpoints a bit more. Azim, you're looking surprised. Now I think, did I get something wrong? Whew, no. First the two of you and then the audience. Yeah.
Can we go to the next slide, the last slide?
Yeah.
Can we go to the last slide? Okay.
This one?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, Sophia, that was wonderful. I really like that. I like especially this focus on, which is your main focus on structural discrimination, because in a way that's, I think, a personal blind spot for me. I think it's a bit of a blind spot for my field as well. We're focused on psychology, and often that means that we focus on the psychology of an individual person. Mainly, I think, because it's so much easier to measure, right? The challenge psychology always had is, how do we make something that's abstract and large and complex and make it measurable? And we've many ways of measuring particular attitudes, explicit, implicit, whatever, it's much harder to do what you're trying to do here, which is to measure these types of systemic discrimination things. So I'm glad that you have all these people who are doing it, because you come up with all these observations, which, as you point out, they cost no one to fix. And so those seem like the low-hanging fruit that should be scooped up for our EDI initiatives. I love that. One of the other, there's so many different directions we can go. Maybe we start just with this one because of it's the most recent thing. And I was thinking we could start with the second one here. Because on the one hand, I feel, I've seen much more than just tipping the balance in terms of these different identity characteristics. And if you look at a lot of Canadian job ads these days, they're not tipping the balance. They're directed hires. They're not just preferential hires. They're targeted hires. So everybody is excluded except for members of a particular group, or in some cases, members of those particular groups are people who study those particular groups. And so I think that maybe in practice, it's a little bit idealistic even for the advocate position. On the other hand, I think that in those types of cases, there are actually a lot of rationales, and I laid out a number of them briefly, as to why it is worth counting those types of things. And merit is a complex category because we have traditional metrics of it, but they don't capture the things which academics really offer. So, for instance, I did a podcast for HxA recently, and I mentioned that if all we were trying to do is hire the people with the biggest IQs for academia, we'd end up exclusively with engineers and physicists. And if all we were trying to do is hire the people with the most citations, we'd end up exclusively with biochemists who study protein folding. But that's not what we want. Of course, we want a diversity of views and disciplines and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to open that up as an area of conversation about merit and the trade-offs that we have for it.
Thanks so much, Azim. I think you're quite right. There are lots of issues to be discussed here under the heading of merit. Let me just firstly reply to your first thought that often there are positions that are labeled as minority positions and others are not welcome to apply. Maybe this varies from discipline to discipline, but in my two, in law and philosophy, although invitations are usually worded in such a way as to specially invite members from underrepresented groups to apply, we actually consider everyone. And we pay very careful attention to everybody's applications precisely because we don't want to miss out on excellent scholars, whatever their background is, whatever they look like. And in my experience, the volume of fantastic job applications that we get, it's just crazy. We'll get 500 applications for one job, and out of those 500, 400 will be truly excellent, and they all could have filled the position. So I guess, although I certainly don't want to deny that in some cases, it's only people from particular backgrounds who are targeted, I feel like often those cases, we get the impression that that's what's happening across the board, whereas actually often it is just a kind of tiny bump in cases where, for example, if that isn't the deciding factor, it will be some other thing that in a sense is equally arbitrary. After all, there are lots of hires that we make based on informal networking, and I know so-and-so who was the supervisor of so-and-so, so I have great faith that that candidate will be a good one. There's a sense in which that is also equally arbitrary and equally unfair from the standpoint of merit to somebody else. But you mentioned some really important points also about ways in which an attention to EDI can lead us to see forms of merit that we might otherwise overlook. And I think I really agreed with what you said about the importance of thinking about diversity and thinking about why we value it. And maybe could you expand on that with respect to merit? What is it in your view that if we value diversity and we think that adds something to our understanding of the merit of various candidates, what does that add? How could we articulate that?
Yeah, great. So if of the 10 different rationales that I put up, I think personally for me the most convincing one is the one about raising different questions, which is I think something that you alluded to as well in one of your slides. There's a good example. So Du Bois writes about this, that when the introduction of black sociologists happened, all of a sudden the questions about race, which is something that sociologists had talked about, shifted in a very important way. When sociology was exclusively white sociologists, the gaps between blacks and whites were explained in terms of what's going on with the blacks. When black sociologists came in, they could say, well, hold on, what's going on with the whites? There was a shift in the burden of who is being explained about. And then you have millions of examples of this. When there was more women medical researchers, all of a sudden there was a lot more attention and knowledge of aspects of the women body that were prioritized, and things that, again, blind spots that male researchers, as devoted as they were to their craft, they weren't considering. In my field, I alluded to this before, there's been a big discussion about liberals and conservatives, and because of the imbalance of liberals and conservatives, oftentimes when we're trying to understand liberal and conservative differences, we do the same thing as those white sociologists did before, which is we'll say, well, look at these differences, what's up with the conservatives, right? Once you have conservative psychologists, you could say, well, maybe there's something going on, maybe there's something peculiar about the liberal mind as well. So in that sense, raising different questions, I think, adds a lot. In the same way, just on a microcosm, as having different disciplines adds a lot. We're tackling different topics, and it's better off that we have maybe less just intellectually stellar people studying different questions than having more intellectually stellar people studying the same questions. And so in terms of what merit is in that case, it's, I guess, merit as to what the academy serves for society. We serve more if we have more questions asked, than if we have fewer questions asked. Just it's really, really, really well.
So can I jump in there? Because I think that really resonates with me. I think it's absolutely right that you used the word helping people pass their blind spots. So we open up our perspectives, we can open up our vision to things that we were completely unaware of. One example of ways in which hiring Indigenous professors to teach courses in Indigenous knowledge and the law at the University of Toronto has vastly opened up my understanding of the law, is that as professors like John Burroughs have taught, often for Indigenous peoples, language is more about verbs than about nouns. And many Indigenous peoples don't think of the law as a noun, as a thing hanging over you that constrains you or prohibits you from doing things. Rather, they think of lawmaking as a process in terms of a set of verbs. And John likes to say that if he hopes his colleagues and his students only take one, if they only take one thing away from his course on Indigenous peoples and the law, it's that even they too can think about law as a process, something that we're all actively engaged in together. And that kind of thing really shifted my paradigm, learning about that and learning about it with respect to particular Indigenous traditions, not just as an abstract thing, that we can actually think about this as an enterprise that we're doing together, as opposed to just a set of regulations hanging over us. So that's another example, I think, of those sorts of paradigm shifts where we didn't even realize we had a blind spot, or maybe it enabled us to think of a whole, it opens up a whole set of questions that we didn't know existed before. And I think where you and I both want to say, not just that they're different questions, but that being able to ask those questions makes our research better.
Absolutely. I think just going back to psychology, again, it seems to me that there's been three big movements in the last decade in psychology. One has been the open science movement. Jessica Flake, who's here, has been a leader in that. The other two have been, I think, primarily driven by Jonathan Haidt, has been this liberal conservative thing, the need to have conservative perspectives injected back into social psychology in particular. And the third, led by some of my colleagues at UBC, has been this idea of the weird people, that we're overly focused on these Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic people, and it gives us a very narrow view of what human psychology is actually like, both overly focused in terms of them as our participants in our research projects, but also as the people actually doing the task. And so there have been all these tabulations of how many psychologists come from Africa or the Middle East or places, and it's just an embarrassingly minute number, and we're missing out on knowledge that we could pick up. The important thing, though, is that when that knowledge is added, it's left to compete on the same plane as all other pieces of knowledge. And one of the things that I think has been a great innovation in the sciences, and I think in the social sciences over time, is that we do not give ideas credit based on authority, based on who said them, based on whether they comport to particular political shibboleths. And it's been great to let ideas compete. And I think the exclusion of these types of cultural positions has been part of that problem that we had that we've overcome. And now I worry that we risk another thing, which is that we favor certain ideas because of where they came from rather than on the merit of the idea themselves. So I think that's, again, probably something we both agree on. Take the bad, but take the good, but let the bad also fall away if it can be fairly criticized. I want to go back a second just to this other point. I don't want to spend too much time on this, about this thumb on the scale versus something more like the targeted hire. Because I take your point that when you see those ads, they're posted publicly, and there's a minor Twitter storm that comes out. In fact, there was, I think it was at UVic, there was a posting several years ago for looking for an Indigenous, I think it was a psychologist, and it was that actually put me on this whole topic, because there was some poor graduate student who'd been reading too much Haidt who said, look, if you really want diversity, and he wrote this on Twitter as a graduate student, if you really want diversity, you wouldn't look for an Indigenous scholar, you'd look for a conservative scholar. And then people piled on him. And it illustrated to me that, well, he's operating under a totally different diversity rationale than the one that UVic was probably operating on. And because we're not talking about them, people get awfully confused about what the reasoning for this actually is, and they assume that other people have similar reasoning, and so why are you pursuing this action if the reason is X? And they don't realize that other people have a different rationale. That's why we have to talk about them. So I get that it is the case that in the potentially infrequent times that this happens, it just becomes overly salient, and there's an availability heuristic which makes it seem more frequent than it is. I think it would be good to figure out how much that actually does happen, because, as I mentioned, my position, and that might be a special position, but my position, there was a preference given. It was a thumb on the scale. Preference will be given for members of these four groups, which very quickly led to anybody not from those four groups not being even considered. Because in the interests of making sure that the UBC Psych Department was as competitive as possible, they thought, well, if preference is given, let's just exclude anybody who doesn't fit that.
Mm-hmm. That's so absolutely. I think we need to. It would be ideal to find some studies on this. I also, maybe I can switch tacks here and talk about, one of the things that resonated that you said with me was, you mentioned that when you were hired into this position, you felt as though everyone knew you were a diversity hire. And I'm wondering whether there's research that has been done, or whether there are steps we could take to ensure that in those situations where a university does feel, let's suppose they need to hire an Indigenous scholar, as in our law faculty, we had nobody to teach Indigenous law. This was a glaring hole. We had to do it by hiring somebody to teach Indigenous law. And we didn't, it wasn't that we were just looking for that and we picked up any old person. We found the best person whom we could hire. But when we do that, are there things we can do as an institution to ensure that those people aren't actually just treated as diversity hires, to ensure that their work is recognized as meritorious, to ensure that it's integrated with the work of others in the discipline? Are there things that could have been done, for instance, in your or other situations to avoid that? That's one of the reasons why I was suggesting that as often as possible we should move toward transformative equality policies. Policies that don't actually single out a group and make them look like they have been targeted for special treatment that they don't deserve, that would somehow suggest that they didn't actually merit this.
Well, I think part of the challenge is that they are being singled out. So you're trying to hide from them something which is actually true, right? So for me, I talked about this with some of my some of my colleagues who are closer friends to me, and they tried to disabuse me of this. Oh, you would have made it had it even been everybody involved, and maybe that's true, but I'll never know. And I know that they're trying to downplay the effect. I mean, I have no idea how big the effect actually was of that. I have no idea whether I would have been able to outcompete the white men who could have been included in that applicant pool. I think I might have been. And that would have been nice to have been to know that I made it on my own record. But maybe I wouldn't have been, and then I would have been stuck at UC Irvine forever. Terrible place. It's not a terrible place. The weather's lovely. But one approach to this that I think has been shown to ease that effect is cluster hires. Which is that instead of hiring just one person, you hire a number of people from that group. And that has a number of benefits. So there is this research on something called the diversity hump, which is that teams that get slightly diverse actually encounter a lot of coordination challenges. So their performance goes down for a bit once you reach some small level of diversity. Problems go up. And a good way to understand why that's the case would be that you are straddle disciplines. I think anybody here, how many people here have done interdisciplinary work with people from some discipline way outside of what they do? And those people will know that it's difficult, and it's difficult because you bring different cultures really with you. You have different assumptions, you have different methodologies, you have different jargon. And when those situations work out, it can create really great research. But you have a survivorship bias there. You have there's a graveyard of littered attempts at interdisciplinary projects which never worked because those challenges were hard to overcome. What the research on the diversity hump shows is that that's a problem when you have a small amount of diversity. Once you reach a large amount of diversity, then those problems seem to go away. So the solution to the problems of diversity often is more diversity. The challenge with that, though, of course, with these cluster hires is that we're often dealing with not a very large a pipeline, not a very large applicant pool to begin with. U of T can probably get the best people and probably several of the best people. But if every university in Canada is looking for the best Indigenous social psychologists, there's really not that many to go around. For many reasons, not least of which it's a small percentage of the population.
Yeah, which touches on this issue that I mentioned, that very often it's easier to come up with satisfactory solutions if one is an institution with a lot of resources.
Yeah. Okay. What else do you want to talk about?
Well, I have some questions for you. So we talked a little bit about this point on my slide to do with merit, but I am really interested by your research into psychological studies, and I'm wondering if you have any general things you could share with us. I share your thought that it's really important to talk openly about the rationale for various EDI measures and to look at hard evidence about their success. My difficulty is that I come from a field where, as you mentioned, when you start thinking about systemic discrimination and ways in which various institutional policies interact, it's very hard to actually measure the effect of each of those policies. I'm sure there are some sociological studies that do it, and in fact, a lot of the legal research that we are doing is supported by some such studies. But at a certain level of generality, especially once you get to the systemic level, it's just very hard to provide that sort of concrete evidence. So you feel sometimes like you're feeling around in the dark. Mm-hmm. If we start thinking about things at an institutional level and thinking about particular policies and trying to measure their effects, what would be the role of psychological studies in helping us get hard evidence about various EDI initiatives?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I wish I had a better answer for you. I wish that was something that I'd gone back after our dinner last night and researched a little while, so I could give you some studies. I don't know that literature all that well, so I don't think I'm the right person to ask. I would not be surprised if people have made very good attempts at doing this. Psychology is very concerned with these issues, and people can be very creative with the ways that they look at it. The other discipline to look at is probably economics. So when I was doing my research for this project on rationales, it took me into a number of different disciplines. And I often found that the economics work was of the highest quality. There's something about the methods that economists use which force them to be often extremely creative in trying to figure out how to measure something which is otherwise very difficult to measure. So maybe that's a place where you could look.
That's great.
And sorry, I don't have a better answer for that.
Maybe we can talk about some other EDI initiatives. Obviously, affirmative action and hiring and such are among the most controversial, but they're also among the most discussed. And talking only about that, I feel, although it's very important, can sometimes give the impression that once we've hired people, we're done with EDI in a university. And whereas actually, once and you've probably found this as you make your way through the university as a faculty member, there are lots of places where I feel particular groups are being disadvantaged and nothing is being said or done, which in turn then starts to make the excessive focus on diversity in hiring look a bit tokenistic, look a bit like it's a kind of virtue signaling, because once we get diverse people on our faculty, we often don't do enough to support their work or to remove various policies that function as barriers. So maybe we can talk about, are there other sorts of measures that you have come across, maybe not measures that are explicitly labeled as EDI, maybe instances of what I was calling transformative equality, that are successful in pursuing what you might think of as the more important rationales for diversity or for nurturing diversity among faculty without having some of the more negative effects.
Yeah, can we, Wadia, can we go back to the previous slide here? Oh. Thanks, Annette. Okay, let's do that after this particular question. So, I mean, one of the things, I'm going to answer the opposite of your question, which is I'm going to talk about the things which haven't been working, I think. Yeah. Because one of the things that we've seen, I think Annett has done research on this, and through Heterodox Academy they've done research on this, and through FIRE they've done research on this, is the declining comfort that people have about speaking really about anything, but especially about these issues in the academy. And as you and I talked about offline, that's true not just for people on the right, that's true for people on the left. Yes. And so there's something about the conversation that we seem to be having about EDI which is leading us in the wrong direction on that, especially if one of the goals is more open inquiry, more diverse views being permitted. It seems like we're allowing more different people in, but then all the voices that they could be bringing get squelched as a result. So I think it's really important to figure out what we're doing wrong there, and maybe look at some initiatives by which we can have these well-intentioned initiatives without the negative consequences that they have in terms of open inquiry, because I think that's a terrible thing to lose in academia. It's the one institution we've carved out in society which is devoted to ideas, and if we lose that bit of academia, then we really lose what I think makes it special. On my list of rationales, I did include, in the very last one, is institutional signaling. And you mentioned virtue signaling right now. I hesitated about putting that institutional signaling one in because I think it's so easy to dismiss as something that is either grandstanding or hypocritical, but I think there actually is a place, a meritorious place, a good place for institutional signaling, which is that we do rely on the beneficence of our society, and we do serve our society as an institution. We should reflect it in some degree. We build our credibility with the society the better we reflect it. And I think that that's true both in terms of the different identity groups that we talk about in EDI, as well as the political groups that we've been talking about. And I think that if you look at it, we're very unrepresentative on a lot of these EDI measures, a lot of measures related to, we're actually pretty good on gender now, actually, but we're still way off on race. We're also way off on religion. We're way off on politics. And we've been seeing the credibility of higher ed diminish, partly because I think people see us as a out-of-touch bubble. I think not necessarily incorrectly. There is some ways we're always going to be different, and some ways that we should always be a little different. But we've been hemorrhaging credibility, and I think that that's the thing which brings me to this topic more than any other, which is that the only thing I could see as an existential threat to higher ed is this diminishing credibility we have with our larger society.
That's very interesting. I think I agree with both of the points you made there. The one being that we need to be careful that we're not just using language in such a way as to virtue signal, because that loses credibility. We're supposed to be an institution that's focused on knowledge and on education in the broadest sense, and suddenly it seems like certain things can't be discussed. But also the idea that there are beneficial ways in which to signal that you are welcoming to a diverse perspectives, and to students who may be unfamiliar with academic discourse. It's still the case that at the University of Toronto, the majority of students I teach, many of them are first-generation university students. And we have to recognize that, and I want them to feel that in many ways this institution is their home, and that they're speaking a language they can understand, and that they don't feel censored when they speak in class.
Yeah, thank you both. I am also curious, is there something about which you disagree? I heard a lot of agreement, and it is good. Maybe if you can have a little moment of reflection about something that you disagree about in order to further explore. But for everyone in the room, I thought if we can take 1 or 2 minutes and each reflect, like maybe take a piece of paper, we have some papers, write down a thought, a worry, a comment, or a question. Maybe that will...
Okay, well, I can go on a couple topics, which I think maybe we'll have some disagreement, or at least you might be able to tell me some stuff that I'm not thinking of. So the first letter in EDI is the E, and that's for equity. It's not for equality. And I know that equity is defined in different ways. You probably know a lot about this. Equality, equity, transformative equality. What's the difference? When are those in conflict, and what's actually the most desirable thing here?
So that's a great question. I think equity is used in a variety of different ways as well. So to be honest, I am not an expert on that. Sometimes it just means giving everyone an equal chance. Sometimes it means not perpetuating unfair social classes or unfair social hierarchies. And those things can actually sometimes come into conflict. Sometimes in order to rectify the existence in society of an underclass, you need to label certain positions as, positions where we're only going to consider women, or some people have argued, and then you don't give other people a fair chance. So that might be a place where those two things came into conflict, and where that would be one of those places I was talking about earlier, where you might need to think about which understanding of equality is more important to us in these circumstances. One thing that is just occurring to me now, I don't know if it's a source of disagreement between us, but I think certainly we don't need to think that these sorts of trade-offs, either between values, justice, truth, fairness, or within a certain value about how we interpret equality. We don't need to think that these sorts of trade-offs are things where we have to come to a single judgment about the appropriate weight of these values across all contexts. I take it one of the benefits of the kind of approach you're taking, Azim, is actually that you're urging us to think in each particular case about the particular kind of diversity we want, the rationale for it, and which rationales are actually justified and which not. And in a sense, I'm arguing that as well. But that might mean that on one occasion, we might say that really considerations of justice trump others, whereas on another occasion, in another context, we might say, look, no, this is actually this is not really a question of justice, or that's not what's at stake in this particular instance.
I hesitate to say I agree with that, because Annett doesn't want us to agree, but I do agree with that. And I think one of the things one of the points that's been made to me when I've listed these 10 rationales for diversity in faculty hiring is, well, I like all of those, and why can't we just pursue all of them? And I guess the problem is that in the abstract, yes, you can pursue all of them, but ultimately, when we hire people, we usually hire just one person, and no one person is going to be the best candidate across all of these rationales. So it does involve, yes, prioritizing which of the values that we do want to follow the most. There's this expression that I heard, which is that a man with one watch always knows what time it is, but or what time to leave, but a man with two watches is never sure. And I think that's true for a lot of these things. When it comes to a concrete policy, we probably do have to figure out which value we want to put first.
This is maybe a place where I disagree with you, just because actually, I'm inclined to think that with respect to certainly with respect to hiring decisions, maybe I have just been blind, but often when I'm on committees that make these sorts of decisions, it's not as though we're thinking about the values in the abstract. Maybe we should be if we were fully informed, but we're often just thinking about a whole variety of things to do with this candidate. So perhaps their cultural background is one factor, perhaps their gender is another factor. We're thinking about how they performed during their job talk. Did they interact with others? Would they make a good colleague? We're thinking about whether they've given sufficient credit to others in their discipline, or do they think they're just coming in and announcing a bunch of new ideas that don't give credit? So there are lots of different factors, and then somehow each person makes an overall judgment. But there's no point at which we're deliberately getting around a table and saying, do you value making this hire on the basis of justice, or do you value making it on the basis of this person's expertise? So I don't see those sorts of values in that way figuring in those sorts of decisions. Now, let me just, I want you to reply, but maybe they would figure more if we had open faculty discussions about this. I'm actually moving to NYU, where in the law school, all hires are voted on by everyone, and there's a big faculty conversation about a hire. Whereas at my current university, the University of Toronto, appointments are made through a committee with deliberations behind closed doors, and individuals only write in with their views. And I'll be interested to see what a difference those different procedures make, but I'm willing to hazard a guess that actually having to have an open faculty meeting at which you present your views and you're forced to defend them and explicitly give the rationale is probably a better way to do it. And perhaps if I were more familiar with that way of doing it, then I would think of this as involving more open trade-offs of values.
Yeah, so lots to say about that. I do think that one of the problems, and it'll be interesting to see what that discussion looks like with a bunch of philosophers compared to what it looks like with a bunch of psychologists, but we do have those types of discussions at UBC, and one of the observations I've made, which is again one of the motivations for this entire project, is that people haven't really thought through why they're favoring diversity. It seems like the thing to do. Diversity sounds like a great word, because I think probably we had all these discussions maybe back in the 80s or 90s, and then people arrived at the conclusion, yes, diversity good, and we've forgotten the reasons why, and now people seem to be just norm following somewhat mindlessly, oh yes, diversity is something we have to prioritize, and I don't think that that's a good reason to follow it. So I do think that making, again, the whole motivation behind my project is making these implicit motivations actually explicit, and so we can have them out and debate them is very important if we're going to make this such a central part of our hiring. Can I just ask,
how do you think we should go about making them, initiating those discussions? So given that you and I agree that it's important to talk about the rationale for diversity, how can we create a climate in which this can be discussed?
Step 2 is that everybody should read my paper. Step 1 is that I should write that paper.
We invite everyone to join the conversation.
Right.
Maybe there are more ideas. So again, I would invite you to take one. There's already the first question. There's another one. There's another one. Oh, many. So, Okay, we thought we'd take a question from Zoom, a question from the room. We have 2 microphones. One is, Gina, you just went. Yeah, no, it's good because we have another one on this side of the room. Okay. One idea. Okay, let's just start, and if we see it's getting too busy, then maybe we have to form groups and decide on questions. But please.
Okay. Is this working? I think so. Yeah. Yeah. It's working. Hi. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion, and I'm very, very happy to see that. Oh, sorry, I should introduce myself. My name is Axel Vandenberg. I'm a sociologist at McGill. I'm very grateful for an open discussion for once, and a mutually respectful discussion for once as well. I wanted to make 3 points. One is I strongly want to emphasize Azim's point, which is that we have to think about what we want diversity for. What's the point of the diversity? And you've come up with these 10 different rationales. I was actually thinking of writing something about this as well, in the same kind of spirit. There's something called epistemological diversity associated with some philosophers such as Helen Longino and various others, where diversity serves the purpose of bringing in new perspectives and ideas, which is what, is it Sophia or Sophia? Sophia was talking about. But there, of course, the diversity that you're seeking is problem and discipline specific. So you have to think about which kinds of groups you really need to add. Right? So there is some literature where this is particularly, I've written a paper on this is particularly the case in some feminist literature, where idiotic claims are being made that women added to, zoology, well, zoology actually is an interesting case, but, to astronomy or something would make a big difference. And that's not obvious. Right? But in some other cases, obviously in medicine, it's extremely obvious. And it should have taken place a long, long time ago, and so on and so forth. There are many critiques based on that. So diversity for what? If it's diversity to compensate for group inequalities, then you have to ask, how are you going to do this? Much of what Sophia was talking about, I recognize from some of the arguments that are being made in my discipline for increasing representation of blacks, representation of various other quote-unquote marginalized groups. And there, the argument or the implicit assumption is that we, at the level of hiring PhDs into assistant professor positions, we can make a huge difference in the degree to which blacks end up being professors. But that assumes that a major discriminatory barrier occurs at the level of hiring PhDs. And if that is a major part of the barrier, then that diminishes all the barriers that supposedly have existed before, which sociologists have been studying since time immemorial. In other words, my point is, which is a well-known point, is that the pool of applicants still is far, far, far lower, and in fact is now probably lower than the actual people being hired from that group, proportionally speaking. The point is that black people disproportionately, particularly in the United States, of course, also in Canada, live in neighborhoods with bad schools. That's where the work needs to be done. The main work that needs to be done at the level of classic welfare state programs. That's where we need to invest, really big time. Health outcomes, there is an enormous literature about discrepancies in health outcomes. Well, we know quite a bit about why that is. And it's not necessarily primarily a matter of, although there are many, many spectacular cases of this, of course, but it's not primarily a matter of nurses and doctors being, discriminating against black patients. There's some of that, no question about it. But a lot of it has to do with network effects, has to do with neighborhood effects, has to do with sheer poverty, has to do with educational deficits, and so on. Those are the things that would create, a fixing of which would create the kind of candidate pool where you could confidently hire on the basis of merit, right? And until you get there, which is of course something that is a very long haul kind of proposition, until you do that, there is going to be a painful trade-off between hiring groups that are people from groups that are considered to be marginalized versus using just merit. So part of my problem with the kind of argument that Sophia brought forward, much of which I agree with, actually, but is that why put the burden of fixing society's inequalities at the very last point in the trajectory of someone's career, right? Why put the burden there rather than emphasizing where the actual discrimination and actual unfairness and actual lack of actual barriers against mobility occur? Now, last point, there's something that nobody seems to be discussing very much, but which groups get actually chosen to be the marginalized ones? How does that work? Well, one obvious way in which this works is that those who have the most active, politically mobilized voices are the ones who get heard. This has been the case for LGBTQ. This has been the case particularly since the George Floyd disaster for blacks. But there are all kinds of other groups that face major barriers towards careers in academia in particular.
Suggest some groups, or do
I'm
you
done.
want?
I'm almost done.
Otherwise, I hear two questions.
Just 1 second. Recent immigrants, or whites, people with very low educational antecedents, single mothers. You can go on and on and on. They're all marginalized to some extent. They all deserve an extra support in getting a chance to making a career in academia. It's a little bit the squeaky wheel that gets to be declared marginalized. Okay, so that's it.
No, thank you very much. So it's why not starting earlier rather than waiting until it's time to hire a professor? And the other question was, how are marginalized groups identified, and aren't there many more, and who is excluded from having the status of such a group?
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to jump in on the first question and say that I think you're absolutely right. Of course we need to start earlier. If EDI initiatives were solely focused on diversity in hiring, this would be a huge mistake. And perhaps we need to have more conversations about how we balance our resources as an institution. In other words, if part of the rationale for EDI initiatives is to ensure that we don't further exacerbate disadvantage, how can we best use those resources? We've had some of those conversations at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, and so we actually run a terrific program called Laws, the Law in Action Within Schools, that's designed to go into schools and provide mentorship and skills that will gradually prepare students, even though law school for many of these students is, 8 years away, 9 years away. For that, you're quite right that some of these conversations, though, have to be had within society at large. Obviously, as a law school, we can't fix huge disparities in resources within schools. That's a governmental problem. So I think we need to see all of these initiatives as working together. But I don't think just because there are things we can do at earlier stages in children's education, that doesn't mean we therefore should do nothing at the hiring stage. I think a lot of these initiatives can helpfully work together. I don't think we want to get too much into this, but I guess I disagreed when you talked about there being painful trade-offs at the hiring stage. If you look at initiatives that deliberately give special mentorship or special awards to a lot of minority candidates with the aim of then helping those candidates get hired, something like NYU's Faculty First Look Scholar Program. A lot of these people are up on the NYU website. You can look at them. They're dazzlingly accomplished people. So I don't see there being any painful trade-off. Why do they need extra help, you might add, if they're dazzlingly accomplished? Well, often they come from less well-known institutions. And so this helps them, give them the kind of visibility they might not otherwise have. But I see that as one tiny part of what I think you and I agree needs to be a much broader initiative. And let me say, you said at one point, hiring is the last point. Why do we focus so much on the last point? I want to come back to this because it was something I was hoping Azim and I could talk about, and we didn't quite get there. I don't see hiring as the last point because, of course, being hired is only the beginning of your career as an academic. Then we need to think about who gets to give the prestigious talks, whose work is cited by others, who wins the medals, who is asked to be a visitor at other institutions. And we need to think about how we distribute those sorts of opportunities. We need to think about the role of fairness and the role of, and ways in which merit can be hidden in those sorts of processes too. So I actually think we need to take your point, I think we need to look at the earlier stages, but I think we also need to look all through different people's scholarly careers.
All right. I also thought it was a great question. We could spend the rest of our event just dealing with that one question. I don't want to, but we could. I made a distinction in my list between what I called social restitution and social reorganization. When we hire people from, let's say, marginalized communities, you're right that when we're getting PhDs, we're getting a pretty unrepresented, PhDs are going to be unrepresentative in any group. To elevate the top members of any group probably on its own doesn't do that much good if we treat it as a way of sort of compensating a group for past injustices by then elevating single individuals. It's probably not great. But speaking to your first point, when you hire somebody who studies a particular topic, and this is true in psychology maybe more so than zoology or some other topic, those people can affect change through their research. And so it's not, I think, about handing out faculty positions as a prize for people. It's more handing out these faculty positions as a duty or a conscription of people to get them to serve the society. In terms of your second question, I think that's a very important one. One of the advantages that we have in hiring faculty is that unlike when we admit students, we admit at a big school like McGill or UBC, thousands of students at a time, we don't have all that much information about each one of them, and so we have to work with proxies for disadvantage. When we hire academics for professor positions, it's through such an enormous amount of scrutiny that we don't have to rely on these just arbitrary proxies anymore. They're group characteristics. We can find out we can try to find out how much disadvantage that particular individual had, and then use that as a way of, in my accounting for the discrimination, figure out then what kind of promise they'll have. You mentioned single mothers. I think that's as somebody who had kids late in life, I realized that a lot of my accomplishments above my peers as an academic was just due to the fact I had more time than most of the people who were dealing with kids at the same time. So forget single mothers, married fathers with kids. That's reducing their opportunities to produce the same level of scholarship, and we can take all that into account when we decide to put them through the whole process of a search.
Yeah, there's so many. Oh, yeah, Zoom, right. I forgot Zoom because I don't see them.
Okay.
Maybe one Zoom question and then from the room again. I think you were next. Yeah, you were next. I think then Alexei, some woman I also thought. Oh my God. Maybe we try that everyone asks just one question and rather short comments.
Okay, so this is a question from Zoom, and I guess it gets to what you were saying, that EDI is not perfect, and there's definitely room for improvement. And I guess the question is about so how can people engage, question, and renegotiate DEI policies, language, rhetoric, when such movement has been taken by university administrators and activist tenure professors, which are in high numbers in the humanities and social sciences, without suffering retaliations, reprisals in terms of job security? So I guess there's a fear of kind of speaking up and pointing out these problems like you're doing right now. How can we do that?
So that is a fantastic question. It's very difficult. I wonder, part of the reason I introduced the language of transformative equality is because that might be one way in which particular EDI policies could be discussed, and we could productively discuss alternatives without actually falling afoul of particular prohibitions or raising. Well, you had very good language at the start of your talk. You talked about people, sometimes the language of diversity can't be questioned. When you had the bull and you were talking about
the sacred values.
Yeah. So changing the discussion to ask, are there particular rules that we can adopt that will actually be inclusive of everybody rather than singling out particular groups? That's a way of having a discussion that is sensitive to the fact that often particular groups' needs have been overlooked, that recognizes what I think is a necessary truth, that they have been overlooked, that groups have been disadvantaged, but that also recognizes that we need to think about everyone's needs, and that allows us to talk openly about the effects of particular policies on particular people. So maybe sometimes asking whether there's a way of transforming the relevant practice so that it's maximally inclusive would work. But as I acknowledged in my talk, that's not going to be available in all cases. You can't transform a hiring practice so that it's maximally inclusive. Only one person can get one job. So that's not supposed to be a magic solution. Azim?
I'm worried that I heard the question wrong, so maybe we just move on to the next question.
It was job security.
Jobs.
Or was it about how to say something, but being afraid that will backlash on you, like how to be open,
Get tenure. And then use it. Get tenure and then get somewhere where you don't want to leave again, so that you don't have to apply somewhere else. It is hard. I'm worried about doing this. I'm sure not everybody's going to like it. I figure I am tenured. I have a little more cover as a person of color to be able to be a little more critical, and so I feel I have a duty to use it. I feel the more people who do it, the easier it is for everybody else to do it.
Yeah, everyone. So it's not just one. Everyone. Yeah.
Check, mic check.
Sorry. This side too.
Hi.
Oh.
It was. It was on, but I was just, did you hit the mute? Mic check, hello? No, it's not.
Click on the button, make sure it's green.
It was, and then I said, here, give me a different one.
I can also just say it out loud.
Oh.
Can I just say it out loud?
No, the Zoom people will hear.
Thank you. Check.
No.
Test. There you go. Thank you. Yeah, it's working now. Thank you.
Hey, so I just wanted to respond to the first question that was asked. And what I retained from that is like, what was the point of diversity? As a person of low educational antecedents, I also missed half of the presentation, but I think it's fascinating because I think the point of diversity is sustainability. As a person who gardens, And if I think about like EDI in a sort of metaphorical sense, when you're trying to build a permaculture garden, you have to think of equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? And what is equitable and diverse and inclusive will change depending on the landscape, and the landscape is subject to like the rest of the world and the globalization and the changing of things, right? And so when we think of diversity, it's not just, again, like not just trying to virtue signal, is trying to create a sustainable system where like, it's trying to create a sustainable system that keeps responding to the needs of the population, just as when you're building a sustainable agriculture system, right? And when it comes to, again, like the whole like the hiring and like not trying to tokenize people and like one person and cannot represent everyone, I was thinking about your thing with transparency. Because I recently was seeing a lot of the dialogue happening with like the hiring of the new Supreme Court judge in the Ukraine, because they're trying to like follow a EU model. And obviously like they can't find like one judge who is going to represent everyone, but the trials regarding like this hiring process is open to everyone. And so it's interesting to get like the input of so many different countries and people into this hiring process. And so even though there's only one person that can be hired, you have the input of so many different people that are vetting this person for all the glaring holes in their background to make sure that whoever is selected sort of satisfies a broad range of people. And so in the fact that we can't just hire one person, I do think it's important to like have transparency when it comes to the hiring process, so that multiple voices could at least be a part of who is chosen, to make sure that the person who is chosen is not muting other people in the process. And then when I was thinking about closed door versus open door hiring policies, it like parallels agriculture. Like in a greenhouse, you can control and have like high productivity in that closed loop system. But then if you subject that same system to like the rest of nature, it's not sustainable, right? And so when thinking about EDI, we have to think about like EDI is there because it creates a more sustainable system. There's so many like brands who have released campaigns that when they're actually released to the public, we're like, well, that was really tone deaf. They didn't realize this, this, and this. Had they had more people in like the room, they would have seen, oh, that was tone deaf. I mean, obviously this group of people is offended, but they didn't know that because it was a closed door system. And so the more transparency and inclusion that we have in the system, the more people feel like they're part of like the institutions that sort of govern their life, right? So I just wanted to like respond to what was said there. I don't really have a question. I think this is really fascinating to talk about. That's it.
Thank you for your comment. I know you raised your hand very early, but we have Zoom. And man, there are more people on Zoom now than at the beginning. I was just about to bump them down and say we get 2 and they got only 1. The numbers increased, and we have this side. So maybe one Zoom question, then you, and then this side, and we go.
So I guess this question is about, how we're picking what we're focusing on in terms of EDI. So obviously race and gender are kind of on the forefront, but why not so much sort of socioeconomic status? Why? Definitely at my institution, I've asked that question many times, and it gets paid lip service, and people don't seem to care about that as a diversity issue.
So one of the reasons why I think we have to focus on the rationales is that the rationales imply different types of diversity. One of the ones we mentioned when we were talking about the single mothers is this accounting for prior discrimination. And I mean discrimination, I think, in the way Sophia means it rather than intentional discrimination. But yeah, certainly if somebody comes from rural Manitoba and got their, say, PhD at the University of Saskatchewan versus somebody who got their degree at Harvard and produced the same amount in their PhD, or even produced somewhat less, then that says something really about their promise. So in terms of the avoiding discrimination rationale, I think, of course, we should be taking into account lower SES. We should also be taking it into account for the viewpoint diversity aspect. I think that if you look at the stats on where professors come from, it's a very a group with very elite origins, many of whom are second generation academics. We're missing out on a lot of voices that way and a lot of perspectives.
I agree.
Okay, yeah. Now you, please.
Yes, please return to the slides from Professor Moreau, the skeptic advocate slide, please.
That's the last one.
My name is Louis Campagna. I am a graduate student at St. Mary's University in Masters of Management and Cooperatives Credit Union. Masters of Management in Cooperatives and Credit Unions. My opinions are my own. So thank you for your presentation and the ensuing discussion. My question is regarding the third skeptic advocate dyad there. And we touch upon the topics of historical injustices and justice. So this begs the question, what is a definition for historic injustices and justice, and how is this measured? Is, for example, historical injustice, are we talking about the amount of harm, and if so, how do we measure the amount of harm on a given identity group? Is it outcomes based, which is another way of evaluating a historical injustice? So I had the time to write out a 2-paragraph thought experiment, but obviously for the sake of time I won't read it out, but perhaps I can at least start it off. And obviously this thought experiment, well, it suffers from the flaws of all such thumbnail reductions of reality, so please do afford me your charity. But I do think the exercise provides some insight into the notion, this notion of historical injustice. Okay, Africa, the middle of Africa, 17th, 18th century, a village, 3 boys, A, B, and C. They're triplets, okay? Now, they're captured by the tribe next door, and there's A manages to escape and returns to his village, lives out his life. B is sold into the Oriental Arabo-Muslim slave trade. C is sold into the transatlantic slave trade. Fast forward to today. Now, this is where my development would come in, but I think that going through that thought experiment, and either through measuring harm throughout generations down to today, and outcomes, I'll come to the outcomes if we use that as our measurement. A, who lived out his life, had many children, and is C today, African herdsman, illiterate, perhaps 60 years life expectancy. B, after surviving the trek through the Saharan desert and surviving the procedural castration, of which the survival rate is estimated about 20%, well, for obvious reason, his lineage is extinct. C, after generations of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, etc., today is perhaps an engineer, a lawyer, or worse yet, an investment banker. So, point being, if we're going to talk about historical injustice, this needs to be defined, it needs to be measured, a measurement of harm over generations, a measurement of outcomes. But at the end of the day, if we're going to readjust shares, which is a definition of equity, for the purpose of historical justice, how are we going to go about all of this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So as you probably guessed, I take the blue advocate position. But I actually think that when we do any kind of EDI initiative in hiring, it's a mistake to think of that as an attempt to rectify a historic injustice. So I think we can, if we want to think of it from a justice-based standpoint or the standpoint of discrimination, recognizing that's one standpoint among others, the best way to think about it is as exercising our responsibility to achieve justice now, given the way in which certain existing policies now tend to exacerbate disadvantage. But I think it's a mistake, for probably the reasons that you're thinking of, to try and allocate academic positions now as a way of compensating for past historic injustices for groups. Why? Well, in a sense, there's a bit of a mismatch there. The historic injustice is generally thought of as an injustice against a group of people, and it's very difficult to fix that by giving a job to one person right now. So my thought is there's a mismatch. There is an issue of justice, but the issue of justice is how can we avoid now perpetuating certain sorts of disadvantages? We want to be sure the university doesn't do that. Let me say, I'm not denying that as a society, we ought to talk about reparations for historic injustices to groups. I just don't think that's the job of a university to do in its hiring policies.
I agree. Sorry, Annette.
I'm so happy. I can go to the next question. There's someone from Zoom, and then I don't know whom to take from that side. Yeah, right. The last table after Zoom. So Zoom, this side, and then that side.
Okay, so from Zoom. So I'm not sure if Sophia sort of said this, but there was a suggestion that you were indicating that EDI is something that's going to be, permanent, kind of never-ending pursuit of absolute representation. I'm not sure if that's what you said, but that was kind of what's in the question. So absolute representation on every level of every aspect of academia and society. So, is it kind of like a self-perpetuating job creation project and not much evidence, with not much evidence or benefit? So do you see an endpoint to EDI is the question, I think.
So thank you. Great question. So firstly, no, I certainly don't see this as permanent. And a lot of the legal measures, a lot of the litigation that has surrounded affirmative action has been on the assumption that even advocates of affirmative action see this as a kind of less than fully desirable but very temporary measure. So then the next part of your question is, well, temporary until what? And that's something that we need, again, to have conversations about. What is this a temporary fix for? Now, from my standpoint, it's partly, I see it partly as a temporary fix for these kinds of cycles of disadvantage that certain groups get into whereby they're inferior to others in society at large. And we want to try and stop those cycles so that no one group forms an underclass. So from my standpoint, if we could ideally reach a state of affairs in which there were no social groups that were underclasses, then even though some people would be more disadvantaged than others, other people would always have more wealth than others, we wouldn't have the kind of social hierarchy that's problematic, and then we wouldn't have a need for these sorts of measures.
Good, thank you. Finally to you.
Yes. I think, like, we're talking about variables here, but I would rather focus on how do we break the sacred cow? How do we break the golden calf in our daily conversations within our academic settings? What is a sort of tangible, more pragmatic way that you could see, like both of you agree that the golden calf is an issue, the holy cow is an issue, and we want to break through that black box. And so in your experience and in your speculation, what are the methods that we could achieve? Because we're not going to solve all the issues, even if we have 10 more of these Heterodox Academy talks, right? So how do we do this at our unit of measurement, of our individual level of measurement? How do we achieve that? And what do you see is the most palatable solution for us as individuals, in groups?
Sure, I can try to take that first. So I think one of the problems is that we have an amplification of the wrong voices. I think that most people, as I mentioned in my talk, are reasonable, fair-minded people who are willing to have open discussions about this, or at least I hope that's the case. Say it's not most people, say it's 40%, say it's 30%. I still think that right now the balance is that the people on the fringes with the more extreme positions, the less movable positions, the more the positions tied to sacred values are the ones who have the microphone. We should give the microphone to the people in the middle as much as we can, so that people get a better view of what the representative openness to the conversation is. I don't think the division is between woke and anti-woke. I think it's between people who are willing to have open conversations about these types of things and people who aren't. And the people who are willing to have those open conversations should do it, which is what we're doing, which is great.
Yeah. Thank you. It's Zoom again.
Just maybe more a question for Sophia. So Azim mentioned quite a bit the sort of lack of political diversity in academia. So how do we fix that? Or what do we do to get more say, conservative or moderate voices in academia, so that there is an understanding of that perspective, and maybe, an understanding for those on the left, maybe to understand what they're not seeing, perhaps because they're in maybe kind of an echo chamber.
Thanks. That's a great question. I think maybe this is related to the previous question, in that part of what's really at issue here is not getting more people so much as not silencing people who are already here. So that raises this difficult issue of how together we can create openness to honestly discussing lots of positions without people, and this relates to an earlier question, right? Without people fearing retribution of a variety of sorts, fearing that they'll face social ostracism, feeling that there will be consequences for them in their career. And those are very difficult questions. Other than noting that it would really be wonderful to move to a place where we could do this. And other than, I think, picking up on Azim's point that maybe perhaps those who have tenure, who are in more of a position to speak out without actually fearing censure, should try and do so that we can try and create a kind of environment that's more open to discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a sociologist too. And a postdoc, and I'm concerned about how we can achieve this responsibility now, because I all share the value of equity, diversity, and inclusive for sure. The thing I'm concerned about is the tool we use, because we use categories that were initially, and we will not forget why they were created for initially. They were created for instaurate hierarchy between people, colonize Africa at the beginning. So I'm a descendant of colonized people from Algeria, and I'm really concerned about using the same category to undo what they were created for. And this is this concern I have, and also the measure you want to use that were created by a dominant population to allow people to access to the same privileges. For me, it's also a point of view from one dominant group that try to apply their vision of equity on another one group. And that's two concerns that I have on this point of view, trying to undo things using the tools that were created for building hierarchy and domination. I think we can use better tools to represent the inequalities right now than using race or gender or this kind of tools. That's my first concern. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really important set of concerns that we haven't yet talked about today, so I'm grateful to you for raising them. I think there are really deep issues to do with how we can try and address equality using categories that were created under circumstances of oppression. And I take it part of what makes this just so difficult is that often those categories have shaped our responses to that oppression. I'm wearing this brooch that's Métis beading that's done by my daughter. My husband and kids are Métis. And one interesting thing about traditional Métis embroidery is that it, like the term Métis, which was, of course, originally a slur, you're mixed blood, you're like, the Harry Potter mudbloods. The beadwork is now emblematic of their culture, but at the same time, actually, a lot of it follows the traditional preferences of white Victorian women, whom the beadwork was sold to. So a lot of the traditional symbols involve flowers, and flowers that are not even native to the places where the Métis people live. So there are really interesting ways in which cultures now and peoples are bound up with, in a sense, the signs of their own oppression. And how we move beyond that is a very difficult question. Other than that, I think this goes back to what we've been saying about creating openness to conversation. part of the answer to that question is that it's not something that we can impose from the outside. It's that particular people who self-identify with particular groups need to feel free to talk about this, and maybe they'll come to different answers themselves. I mean, speaking as best I can for the Métis people, I think they're now they have adopted the term Métis. They're willing to acknowledge that oppression forms a part of their past, that they are a distinctive group. They're now negotiating various self-government agreements. They're actually engaging in a very wonderful version of this process in the course of having negotiations over self-government. And there are quite explicit discussions, for instance, within the Métis Nation of Ontario about who we are, who do we think we are, what is the language that we can productively use going forward. So maybe that might be one such model to look to. But these are very important questions for us to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad I didn't skip.
One more thing? I'm sorry to add one more thing. One of the observations I've made as a psychologist is that whenever an extreme position is taken, the other side uses the extremity of the other position to get extreme themselves, to justify taking extreme positions. And I fear that that's why we have this backlash pendulum situation, that it's so easy to justify taking an unsupported and extreme position yourself because you can point to the other people and say they're doing it. And I think that's what we have to stop. We have to slow the pendulum.
And I think what the point is, what Sophia said, we have to talk about it. We have to discuss. Sometimes there's resistance to change, but we have to talk what is reasonable and what can be done and where it has a price that we don't want to pay as a society. I give the word to Zoom.
Sure. So this kind of follows on from that, talking about it, it is one of the issues why it's maybe hard to talk about EDI in a university setting, is that you've got all these different disciplines who have, and some are very quantitative based and some less. And so does that create sort of a barrier for a university or academia in general to sort of start talking about and kind of understand EDI? Is that there's just different... Some people are coming to this in a very kind of data-driven, meta-analysis kind of way, and others are, not kind of as open or not sure about that kind of data-driven approach.
Yeah, I think that is a problem. I think that one of the problems, including in my field, is people knowing the answer to the question before they really try to answer the question, and accept the methods only if they reach the correct answer. So once you have quantitative methods which lead to an answer that somebody doesn't like, then they start criticizing the method. And same on the other side, I imagine. I am attracted to the quantitative social science side because I think that they do provide better answers. But I get people's skepticism of that. I think that that's what makes the interdisciplinary work so hard and so important, is we can hash out our methodological differences, figure out where the weaknesses are, and then hopefully come up with solutions which incorporate the best of all of them.
I just jump in here. I think that one thing that question brings out is just that we probably don't talk enough as members of universities about the goals of universities. So some of the reasons why we don't have conversations about EDI are that we don't have many interdisciplinary conversations at all about what we're supposed to be doing as a university. And maybe what this suggests is that maybe we should start having some of these conversations. What exactly are the university's obligations to society at large? What are its aims? What are the aims of particular universities? Because obviously particular universities, especially newer universities in more remote locations, perhaps have evolved in response to a particular set of needs, so maybe they will have a particular set of goals. Interestingly, the law schools that I have been part of tend to have more of those conversations because, of course, we're training students for a particular profession. We're all supposed to be concerned with justice, so there are more of those conversations, but I'm not really aware of nearly enough happening at the level of the university as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's great to add to that, I would say we should expect these conversations to be messy and difficult and often acrimonious. And one of the things that I've learned digging into the research on diversity is that it seems to always come with coordination challenges. It seems to always be difficult. And I think we have a tendency, especially academics. Academics tend to be a more introverted, agreeable group than usual. Maybe not philosophers, but the I was only sort of joking about that. We tend to shy away from that type of conflict, and one of the ways we shy away from that conflict is to insulate ourselves in our own disciplines. I think we have to embrace the conflict, as conflict diverse as we might be. We have to be ready for these conversations to be very difficult and to have our feathers ruffled. It's a difficult thing to do because we're working against our natures, but I think it's really important for our jobs. And as I mentioned, the jobs are not about us, right?
Thank you. Was there another question over there that I missed? Because otherwise I have someone on the other side.
Thank you very much for both your presentation. And I think you have the ability to agree with each other, which is admirable. So it's more of a concern. Yesterday we had a speaker that brought some data about the opinion on white people. And so in the comment, people reacted a lot as that's white fragility. So that's a phenomenon that was observed when people of color were trying to discuss some issue, that they were too fragile, that you just have to go over it. And so it's interesting because in your presentation you say the failure to see difference within one group. So if you're from Quebec, for example, French Canadian versus Anglophone. If you're from a small town, white people from small town versus Montreal don't think alike at all, don't have the same experience at all. And so you also have, for example, if you're Anglophone in a small town in Quebec, if you're from Irish background, there's a multitude of identities within that group. Also to eliminate stereotype. It's so interesting because you're talking about blind spot. If you're part of people that come from other background, there's language for white people that are not flattering at all, like walking money, or for example, like white women. So I lived in the US, and the way they talk about white women, it's like quite shocking. And so if you're a French Canadian woman, you don't necessarily come from that elite background. If you come from a fille du roi, which were often that brought here by the crown. So are you at any point able to conceive that idea that even though, like, I would even say like white are the majority, because in the world white people are a minority. So are you even able to conceive that perhaps there might be some issue with how people are conceiving whiteness and white people right now, and that if we're not careful, the idea that they're more violent, I heard that. Also that are they human because they're able of so much violence, that they are responsible for most of the ill in the world. And so the data of the first speaker was talking about that, and it was completely rejected by a lot of people. And so are you able to conceive that as we have more immigrants like me, if we are not careful about how we construed white people, like we're opening doors to a really dangerous place. And if we're training people to think about race constantly and divide people, and that racism, you can't be racist if you're black, or that you can be oppressed if you're white, those are dangerous ideas to go around, I think. So that would be
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's very helpful and very important. You're certainly right. Right now, one of the things I find encouraging, at least about the legal literature, is that it has wholly embraced this notion of intersectionality, not just with respect to subordinated groups, but with respect to any social group. The thought is we need to look very carefully at who we're talking about and who people think they are and what the different intersecting factors of their lives are. So we need to think about subgroups within any group. We don't want to talk in monolithic terms, for instance, about Black Canadians. We also don't want to talk in monolithic terms about white Canadians. There are interesting instances in which plaintiffs have lost lawsuits before the Supreme Court because they were white women and viewed as too privileged, and the assumption was that the kind of woman who should have brought that claim to succeed should have been a woman who obviously looked underprivileged. And those sorts of decisions have been highly criticized. So I agree with you. We want to be careful that we don't stereotype anyone. I think the thought is still that it's precisely if we're more concerned with avoiding the kind of society in which there are underclasses, we want to be especially sure that we don't unfairly stereotype members of who are either a member of an underclass or might threaten to be an underclass. But I take it, it's quite right. We want to be sure we don't stereotype anyone. And one group that has come up periodically in our conversation that I think a lot of us think should often be included in these EDI initiatives are, for instance, first-generation students of any background. Or underprivileged students of any background. If we just stereotype people into particular groups, those students might fall away. We might not actually look at them and understand their disadvantage for what it is. So I think thinking about intersectionality is very important. Thank you.
I would give it to the Mr. And
Test?
You're the next after Zoom.
Great. Just two quick comments. The first comment is thank you both. This has been one of the, in my entire academic career, this has been one of the more interesting and thoughtful discussions that I've heard, and I really appreciate it. I am really disappointed that there isn't more of this at institutions like this. The second thing is a comment regarding the question about how to address these kinds of problems. And it seems to me that, as was pointed out, there's a tendency for the extremes to dominate the conversation. And I think one way you try to overcome that is perhaps to try to find common ground. And I noticed that a number of suggestions here are actually much more general than about EDI, depending on how you think about EDI. So I was just looking at Azim's list at the beginning. This seems to me just rational decision-making about any university policy. You know, what are your goals? What are the trade-offs? And what are you trying to achieve? And so it seems to me that my suggestion is, and then you can react to this, is that there's enough literature there, and I'm thinking of things like Daniel Kahneman's work, where I've witnessed in hiring committees complete irrationality that doesn't have anything to do with EDI. This has to do with lots of other things. So it seems to me that this kind of approach of kind of generalizing it, let's look at this as trying to bring in more rationality and evidence into a discussion. It seems to me that should dampen down the extremes. Maybe it won't. But anyway, just don't want to end. Thank you very much. I really appreciated it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, it works?
Good. All right. I'm Andrew Ryder. I'm a psychologist at Concordia University, and I trained as a cultural psychologist at UBC. I think we narrowly missed each other. I would have graduated in 2005.
I was there.
You were there?
Grad student.
Okay. So I got my PhD at UBC in cultural psychology.
Darren Lehman, Steve Heine?
Steve Heine. And we used to talk a lot in cultural psychology about how, I mean, especially in kind of interdisciplinary debates about anthropology, is how general are we comfortable being with a group membership? Like, I have findings from China. Chinese people do X and Y, or Japanese people do X and Y. Then you can drill down and say, well, actually, we're talking about smaller and smaller and smaller groups. And then you can get groups that are so small that it's, you know, anthropologists are comfortable. It's 3 Andean villages, and psychologists get frustrated and want to do something else. So I'm thinking about this problem now with regard to EDI. And it is sort of a set of little questions. How do we define the groups that need the the targeted hire or the additional consideration? How do we know what groups those should be? And how do we know whether a particular candidate we're looking at is a member of that group? And I think it's possible to raise these questions and say, oh, it's all so complicated, we shouldn't do any of it. That's not really what I mean. I'm actually curious if you've seen successful examples of this being done. A few years ago, everyone I talked to about this said, oh, it's very easy, you do it by self-identification. But I know in some Indigenous hires, it's become very controversial, and Indigenous communities themselves are saying, well, wait a second, it isn't just self-identification. There's a whole other system behind Indigenous identification. It may not be the same for other groups, but I'm curious if you've seen successful examples of thinking through this, or what should a department like mine do when it tries to figure out, it has a general commitment to EDI and hiring, but is going to engage in a process of thinking through how that's actually going to work, how it's going to be these groups defined this way, and we'll recognize who's in them in this way.
It's a good, very, very practical question. I can think of a few things which we do poorly. It's easier to identify those, and maybe we stop doing them, right? So one thing that frustrates me is when there's a lack of transparency in terms of what are implicitly targeted hires, that people will have welcome applications from everybody, but then only look at a subset of them. That's wasting a lot of people's time, and it's also dishonest. So I don't think we should be doing that. If you are going to do a targeted hire, you get the proper legal permissions to do so, and then you do that. My suggestion would be that because, as I mentioned before, we can collect so much information about people and we can put them through a real ringer when we hire them as professors, that you do treat people as individuals and figure out what their actual individual background is. But it's easier said than done, because how do you actually figure out that background? One of the ways that we've started doing that is with diversity statements. The problem is that in that equation I put up, where you have past accomplishments divided by opportunities equals what did I say, future promise or something. It's much easier to goose that fewer opportunities number than it is to goose your past accomplishments number. You can work on the denominator and making that bigger, making your opportunities smaller rather than making your past applications seem bigger. And I think the incentives on diversity statements are for everybody to do that. Some people are going to be reined in by honesty, but you don't need very many dishonest people in a pool to render those diversity statements very problematic. So that's an impasse that I've come to. I don't really know the best way to do that without invading people's privacy by circumventing self-report in really uncomfortable ways.
Can I just say, I think it's a great question. I think from my standpoint, the answer depends a lot on what the point of the particular EDI policy in question is. So, for instance, if the point is some kind of epistemic diversity, then you're targeting someone who has an expertise in a particular area, and that's really what you will focus on. And then presumably in some cases, those will be judgments that you're able to make as a department. Oh, the following group fits that criteria. But in other cases, you will also want to ask members of that group in question. So for instance, maybe you're a law school and you realize that there's this glaring hole. You don't have anyone to work on the interaction of the justice system with Black Canadians or Black Americans. Then you may want a scholar of a certain background, but obviously you also want someone who works in that area. And so that will partly target that. In other cases, the policy might seek out particular groups for certain quite particular local reasons. So I know that Dalhousie, for its nursing program, has a quota system where 40 out of the 225 seats are reserved for Mi'kmaq students and African Nova Scotia students from the local area. And the thought is that's because the point of this particular EDI initiative is to train nurses who will then go back and live in the local area and improve medical care, because local people will be able to identify with them from certain backgrounds and so on. So that's a nice example. It's not as though Dal just kind of randomly said, okay, we're going to improve diversity and these are some good groups. They had a quite particular objective, and then they narrowly tailored the group in question to achieve that objective. So hopefully in more cases we'll be able to do that, and then it will seem like it's not an arbitrary decision at all. It's one that is narrowly and appropriately tailored to the purpose of the policy.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I know medical schools do the same thing in reserving spots. And that's a good example of how nebulous this merit category is, because if the thing is to serve Canada, then you're maybe not doing that well by taking the very, very smartest people at the top of the class. If all of them want to be concentrated in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal, you're missing out on really what the point of the education is. And I also really like this epistemic point. If the goal is to get viewpoint diversity, then using proxies for viewpoint diversity, like what their ethnic background is probably the wrong way to do it. And it's mildly racist way to do it too, is to just expect that because somebody has a different skin color, then they're going to have a different perspective, especially when you have the ability to be able to get the information about what people's perspectives actually are based on their scholarship. You can't do that maybe when you're, as I said, admitting thousands of undergraduates every year, but you certainly can do that when you're hiring one professor.
And when you invite people to speak at events. I've been invited to events where I get there and I'm part of a panel, and I then realize that I was invited because people assumed that I would give the feminist standpoint just because I'm a woman, even though I don't actually write feminist legal philosophy as such. So yeah, we have to be careful when we delineate these groups.
All the more reason to talk about the rationales. One more plug. Last one.
We are running out of time. Yeah, you could have. Maybe can you read us maybe the next 5, and then our speakers can each pick one.
This is the last question on Zoom.
That's the last. Okay, perfect.
Okay, so if we pursue affirmative action that penalizes certain people for the past actions of others, thinking about those people that are being penalized, should we not engage with them through dialogue instead of directives? The vitriolic tone of recent identity politics may be obstructing sustainable policy progress. So maybe I think the question is kind of, saying that maybe there's too much identity politics. There's too much sort of vitriol being thrown out there, maybe against certain groups, who are being penalized by affirmative action. I think that's the question.
Like Asians? Who are we talking about here?
I don't know, but
okay.
Yeah. So those that are being penalized by affirmative action. So I guess the question is, if you're being penalized by affirmative action, should there not be more of a dialogue instead of just being a directive? So trying to communicate, I guess, the why we're doing affirmative action.
I mean, it looks like your answer's on your slide, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have a pretty broad conversation about affirmative action. I think people talk about it a lot, and I think that's good. Yes, I think people should be honest about the aims of, yeah, I would. One last plug. No, I think that there definitely should be more conversation about this. I do worry a little bit. And this goes back, I think, to Valerie's question as well, that the increased focus we've had on race has, over the last, say, 5 or 10 years, has exacerbated some of the racial problems more than it's fixed them. I think it's done both, probably, but I wonder what the net balance is to having everybody think about race, including their own race, all the time. It might be us moving in the wrong direction here.
We may actually finally have hit on something that we disagree on, because I actually don't think we think about it enough. I think there are, for instance, I have been astounded over even just the past few years to realize how little I actually understand about various forms of racial segregation that existed in Canada. The school system in Ontario was de facto racially segregated for many, many years, and I was largely unaware of it. So I feel like there's always more we can learn. I guess I agree with you in the sense that I don't feel it should dominate every conversation, but I feel like there's still more to learn. Can I just go back to this question for 1 minute, though? I think it's important to realize if we're going to have an open discussion about affirmative action, that its point is not to penalize the people who don't get the jobs. The word used was, why should we be penalizing some for the actions of others? I don't think that's what it does. It just doesn't give certain people a job. And unfortunately, with affirmative action, unlike the many other EDI initiatives that I listed on that one slide, it is a kind of zero-sum game. There's only one job. So no matter what wonderful policy we come up with, somebody will not get a job. And it can't be that we regard that person as penalized just because they didn't get the job.
So I think we may have hit on another area where we disagree, and really this is terrible timing.
It is fine that you agree.
I mean, my feeling is that this most recent Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court decision was on the basis of the fact that you had Asian students actually genuinely being penalized in their personality scores being reduced in order to lower their entire score, in order to engineer a particular quota that you wanted. I think that's what the allegations, which were I think well supported against Harvard, were. I mean, you're
penalized, to my view, means punished. Nobody's punished when they're disadvantaged. They're disadvantaged, and we can talk about whether it's fair to disadvantage members of certain groups just because they're a member of that ethnic group. I take it that's really what's at issue. Is it fair to give an advantage to members of certain races and to disadvantage others? But penalize suggests somehow that you've been stigmatized, and that's what I want to resist. I don't think that not getting a position at an elite university amounts to a stigma on you. In particular, in a context where the point of these sorts of programs is to reduce pre-existing stigma that other groups have suffered from historically.
Okay.
Yeah. It shows this is just a start. Yes. Like, not all the questions could be posed, not all the comments could be done, and it feels like we are scratching the surface, and many things I would have loved to discuss further, not just have one comment. But okay, it's a start, and we are here, we are the campus community. You can join us. And I'm also saying this because there was the question, retribution, I'm scared to say something, and maybe it helps to have some comrades or to hear from others, from other members of our community, what they do, because it does take courage. And we can continue the conversation, and hopefully it changes something. And thanks again to our speakers who had the courage to show themselves. Thank you. Oh yeah, and we have the QR code on these cards on the table it's just a 2-minute survey. And if anyone would be willing to speak with our interviewer, that would be amazing. And thank you came, and sorry Tim Hortons canceled my order. No, not Tim Hortons, DoorDash. Yeah, I had croissant and a muffin and coffee. Yeah, at least the apples. Well, I wish you a good weekend.